Hi, this is Dr. Mitchell, and in this video we're going to walk through an explanation and a description of celiac disease. Now, we're talking about celiac disease here with proteins because it is related to gluten and gluten's role as a protein, and so this is probably a good chapter to talk about it. Celiac disease has received a lot of research in recent times, though we've known about it since the 1800s. It's really only been the last maybe 50 years or so that there's really been much really good research in it. And I'd argue probably the last maybe 10, 15, 20 years when a lot of study of the human genome has become really in vogue. So let's talk about what celiac disease is, what it's not, what its causes are, and then what are the nutritional issues. So by definition, celiac disease is a medical condition caused by the interaction of gluten with the intestinal cells. Now, gluten is a protein found commonly in a lot of foods. Gluten's in the Bible, by the way. When Jesus fed the 5,000 fish and barley, barley has gluten, as does rye, numerous other grains, and it's a very important constituent of these grains to let them rise, to let them have the texture that they need to. So one misconception is this idea that gluten is bad. Gluten's not bad. It's not an artificial chemical. It naturally exists in these foods. Um, and what really is going on in true celiac disease, and true celiac disease is otherwise known as celiac sprue. That's a little more the more medical term we see in research that's used a lot. Really what's going on is that when individuals who have celiac disease ingest gluten, gluten makes its way to the small intestine. We've talked about that previously when it comes to digestion and absorption of carbohydrates and proteins and fats. When that occurs, there's actually proteins in this gluten. There's prolamins, there's gliadins, and these gliadins actually are able to travel into the mucosal cell. It actually causes a T lymphocyte interaction and causes an autoimmune response. That then causes destruction of the villi. If you remember when we looked at small intestine, the mucosal cells have villi, which increases their surface area. Well, when you destroy those villi, you really hamper digestion and absorption and, truth be told, dysfunction of the small intestine. That can cause numerous symptoms from diarrhea, other GI distress, to more serious things like malabsorption of proteins, fats, minerals, things like that. And so the real concerns with celiac disease isn't the gluten itself, it's all the other things that go along with it. Now, that's what celiac disease is. And the research is a little wide ranging on this. I think most of the good data says about a little less than 1% of the world population has this. We tend to see this higher in the more developed world, particularly in Europe. We see rates a little bit higher. I was just reading a recent study that said about 1 out of every 30 Americans has this. Now, that doesn't mean it's 1 out of 30 that have the outward symptoms. And in fact, there's a lot of good data now that a lot of individuals who have this disorder don't actually express symptoms. They don't have the destruction of villi to a large extent. And so that's celiac disease. And so again, a lot of controversy with this. And the truth is, we do find gluten in a lot of foods. My guess is all of you have consumed gluten at some point. And not just in breads, but in deli meats, in soups, broths. We see that very commonly. And so a very, very big role gluten has. Now, that's celiac disease. And for individuals who have this, and by the way, we generally consider this a genetic disorder. There are certain sequences we look at. This is not a class on genetics, but in studying the genome, we know there are certain indicators we find that if individuals have them. So this is a largely genetic disorder. There's research that says there's other environmental influences. I think that's probably true. So someone who has this disease is definitely recommended to not consume gluten, and because the side effects are substantial. If long-term, if untreated, if severe, can cause death. And so this is something that is definitely a serious condition and something we want to be aware of in regards to the symptoms. So that's celiac disease. Now, my guess is you've heard of celiac disease because of gluten and a lot of the push nowadays, and there's a lot of push in media as far as gluten-free and that being good and better choices. Well, oftentimes what we hear discussed nowadays isn't so much celiac disease is gluten sensitivity. And we generally put this in a different category because this is a non-celiac condition. These are individuals who do not have these genetic markers for celiac disease, but they do seem to express some discomfort, some GI distress, some symptoms when consuming gluten-laden foods, like ones we've discussed before. And this is where the data gets a little bit mixed, because I've seen anywhere from 5% of individuals suffer from this to as high as 40%. That seems like a lot, but and gluten sensitivity becomes difficult because there is not an obvious source. There's not an obvious reason for a lot of these symptoms. And to throw on top of that, one of the difficulties is that oftentimes foods with gluten, tend to be not the best nutritional sources, right? Think of, cupcakes or, foods that might have gluten. If you remove those from your diet, cookies, if you remove those from your diet, well, and you start to feel better, you start to see alleviation of symptoms, well, is it because of the gluten that's being removed, or is it because they're just better choices of food? And that's a good question. And so I think when we talk about gluten sensitivity, I don't dismiss it. It's very real. Individuals who have these symptoms are very real concerns. But this is very different than celiac disease itself, where we're seeing actual damage to the villi, actual antibodies being produced against these proteins that exist. We don't see that in gluten sensitivity. So definitely want you to know what celiac disease is, what its function is, what gluten is, its role, and then what gluten sensitivity is as far as its role and how that's different than celiac disease. Okay, I hope that helped, and we will see you in the next video.